What's up, Aspen? How y'all feel? I'm laughing at what a great job Aspen does in coordinating and producing an event. I do many of these things, and the thought and the details is amazing. So please give it up for the Aspen staff and team who puts this incredible show together down to the ding, Rob. Did you like that ding?
I noticed that. That was like, Mike, get going.
I was like, okay, let me start talking,
Let's do it.
like immediately. Aspen, I'm so excited to be here. This is my first Aspen Institute, and I hear that I am in a place where there are great minds who are active listeners, who are engaged, and who love to ask questions, which is great for me because I love a two-way dialogue. The audience for me is a third party to the conversation, but don't worry, I won't call on you unless you want to be called on. And I am excited because we are here to talk about some big issues that are pressing not only America, but the global community as a whole. And particularly when we think about technology and artificial intelligence and generative AI, all these are big buzzwords. And so I have the absolute pleasure for the next 48 minutes and 50 seconds to talk with the genius individuals who are thinking through these very complicated problems. And what I love about this, though, is that we may not get to the answer, but as a former engineer, we were taught to do case study interviews. It's all about how are you deriving and getting to the answer. And for me, that's where the beauty is, and that's where the learning comes from, and that's where you get complete understanding. And the first gentleman that I'm going to be in conversation with, I have had the chance to get to know in less than 18 hours, and he is the coolest cat in the room that will give Usher a run for his money with his microphone that he has, and is easy to talk with about these very complicated issues. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to Rob Sherman, the Vice President and Deputy Chief Privacy Officer of Meta. Rob, how you feeling, man?
I'm feeling good. I think that's the first and last time that anyone will ever say that I'm giving Usher a run for his money, but I will take it.
Listen, a win is a win.
I mean, let's do it.
I mean, so for those who may not be familiar with the terminology that we're talking about, you're at a dinner party full of strangers, and you're asked to say, what do you do at your job? Go.
It's a good question because my title is a mouthful. I've been working at Meta since it was a company called Facebook for about 12 years, and really what I do is two things. One, I work with a bunch of experts across the company on building technology that helps bring people closer together, trying to make sure that we're building the technology to create value for people and to build it responsibly. And then the second part of what I do, which is really why I'm here at Aspen, is talk to experts out in the world, people, governments, academics, normal people who use our products to try to understand what is their cutting edge thinking about how we can make sure that we're building our products in a way that work for everybody in our community, not just a few people in Menlo Park in California, but the whole community globally.
When you think about community globally, sometimes the global aspect gets left out of sometimes social discourse, particularly here in the United States. We often forget about just how global of a platform Meta actually is and how much the global community leverages and uses the products. So the question I have for you is, the United States is trailing when it comes to creating regulations, when it comes to AI, when it comes to data privacy, but there are other countries out there who seemingly seem to be a little bit more ahead of us. As this patchwork goes about, how are you guys thinking about your product innovation and creativity in relationship to different regulations across the globe?
Well, I think one of the things that's maybe unique about the moment that we're in, and I've spent a lot of time, I work on artificial intelligence, but I've also thought about mixed reality, about the laws that apply to our social media services. So I've been thinking about this in a lot of different directions. And I think what's maybe unique about the moment that we're in when it comes to AI is how quickly the technology is moving and how quickly the regulation is moving at the same time. And we really need to think about, as a society, what are the right ways for this technology to be used? How should we make sure that people have access to it and that it creates opportunities for people that might not otherwise have opportunities, but that also we're guarding against the harmful uses of it or the risks that it might have? And so I think because we're in a period where you can't just write the rules and then wait a couple of years and then the technology will appear, we're actually doing both of those things at the same time. What I think is important is we have a different model for how we build regulation. And it has to be a lot more collaborative than in past generations. And what I mean by that is we as companies, people that are building this technology, need to sit down with governments collaboratively and say, what are the right things that we should be doing? What do you want to see us doing? Open our doors and let them understand how we're building technology and do that collaboratively, and then also work with them to figure out how we should do this in a way that serves the global needs. So 2 examples of how we're doing that. One is I actually just about a month and a half ago was in Korea, and there was a global safety summit for AI. And this is a bunch of companies and academics and governments coming together for the second time, and then there's another one coming up next year, really to talk about how do we, as a global community that have a stake in this, how do we think about the way that it should be built, and what are the constraints that we want? How do we want to make sure that everybody is doing it in a thoughtful and safe way? And so I actually think that getting together as a global community to make those decisions and think about what works in the US is not going to be the same as what works in Mexico, is not going to be the same as what works in Ghana, and we have to really think about all those things. So that's one big area where we're doing it. The other thing that we've done is this idea of policy prototyping. And so we've done that, in Singapore. We're doing it in the United States now with the US government, where we partner with governments and say, hey, we have an idea on how we might want to think about regulating AI. Let's try it and see what works. Try it with big companies like us, but also smaller startups, nonprofits, other kinds of organizations, and let's see if we put this into practice, whether it actually works and whether it serves the needs of the people that we're trying to serve.
Let's unpack that a little bit more, because that's very complex, because you just mentioned Korea, you mentioned Ghana. Those are 2 different countries, right, that has completely 2 different cultures, that has 2 different systems of government, 2 different styles of constitutions. And so the key word that I'm getting out of your job title is privacy. But privacy can mean so many different things to different people and to different countries. So how do you think about privacy regulations and systems when you're when you're engaging with different governments that have different cultures and constitutions?
Well, I think the starting point is we need to provide services that both protect privacy of, but also more broadly, just serve everyone who's in our community, right? And so when you use a word like privacy, the challenge is when you talk to different people, they're actually not all meaning exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. Like some people are worried about, I want to make sure that I can control who sees the stuff that I post on Facebook. Some people might be thinking about, I want to know that the information that this AI is generating for me is only for me and it's not going to be used by somebody else. Some people are worried about the government and they want their communications encrypted. And so what I think our responsibility is as a company is not to just say, okay, we're going to adopt this one definition of what we need to do, but instead to think broadly and talk to people and say, okay, for all of those different people that have those different needs, what can we do to build our technology in a way that serves them?
But how do you balance that though, Rob? Because there is a dynamic where you can have too much thought process, too much regulations, too much catch-all, and then you can also stifle the innovation. So how are you guys thinking about threading that needle?
Well, I think a big part of it is talking to people early as we're building the technology, right? So if you wait until the end and you have different laws in different places, it is very hard for people because they have different things that they can expect, different protections that they can expect. It's also hard for us as a company to have different, especially when you're talking about something like artificial intelligence, which is inherently global, and the services we provide are inherently global, making sure that we're serving everybody's needs in different ways is important. So the starting point is we really want to think about what are the problems that people are asking us to solve, and as we're building the technology, build in solutions to those problems. Now, there's always going to be different governments that are going to have different expectations, and so here in Colorado, they have different laws than are in California, and so there's always going to be some element of you're going to have to disclose things in a slightly different way in this place versus that place. I don't think we're ever going to get away from that, but what I do think we can do is have these conversations early so that we're identifying what are the problems that society needs us collectively to solve.
Well, then that leads me to data and data collection, because as you think about the problems that society's needs and solve for, these different generative AI tools and products that are being created off of data sets. And so how are you guys thinking about data sets that these machines can learn off of that has different cultural context while at the same time keeping the privacy intact?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple pieces that I'll highlight. The first is the data that is used to train AI, right? So I think what most people may or may not know in the room is when you build these AI systems, it requires a lot of data so that it learns, right? So what these systems are doing is they're learning language, but they're also learning correlations between ideas. And so when you say, tell me about Mike Muse, it's going to have some context and be able to give information. And so that requires a lot of information. In order to do that responsibly, I think the first thing, and this is something that actually came out of some of those conversations, is we need to make sure that we're training on a broad enough data set that it serves everyone, not just the majority. And so a big part of what we do is we think about how do we get data into the model that make sure that the different people who may want to use it have their cultures represented, have their ideas represented. And that's an evolving thing. It's not a thing that we'll just do and then be done. But we need to think about making sure that the data is broadly representative. We also then need to look at how the model performs based on that data. So we say, okay, we have a bunch of people who look at the output of a model and you actually just sit and test it and ask it questions and see, is it answering questions in a biased way? Is it answering questions in a way that encourage people to commit crimes, for example? And then we take steps in building the model to carve those things out. And so a big part of that is talking internally and making sure that we're thoughtful and take the time to do that tuning. A big part of it, though, is making sure that both the data that goes into the model and the people that do that work on the back end are thinking about things from a broadly representative global perspective.
With that being said, I would think that what would keep you up at night is trust, right? Like, how can the users of these products trust the output of the systems, that this data has been secured and it's safe and has different types of representations of the guardrails?
Yeah, so I think a big part of it is applying protections at different levels of the stack, like we're talking about. You mentioned privacy, and so part of that is excluding certain kinds of data from the data set if they're private, or taking steps to remove personally identifiable information. But one of the things that we've really emphasized in our strategy, which is a little different from how other companies have handled it, is we've leaned really heavily into this idea of open source AI. This idea of taking the technology and making it broadly available. So, and that serves a couple of purposes. I think one is it helps with the transparency and trust thing that you're talking about, which is, rather than having to trust us and that we've built our models in a certain way or they work in a certain way, if they're open source, anybody can look at them and test them and pressure test them and react to whether we've done things in the right way or not. We also have done and will continue to do a lot of publishing, both for normal people and also for experts, papers that talk about the details of how we build this stuff. So that's one piece. But I think there's also, some maybe more self-interested aspects of why we would open source as well. The first is making progress on innovation, right? I think our bet is that if we open up the technology and make it available so that other developers can build on top of it too, as a society, we will move forward more quickly than if we're just doing our stuff in a silo and then another company is doing their stuff in a silo. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that I think is good for the world, but also is a little bit self-interested for Meta, is building an ecosystem and maximizing the impact of the technology that we're building. Because if we are building technology, just us in Menlo Park, we're going to be able to serve a couple of different use cases. Like, let's say we say that education and healthcare are the things that we focus on. We're not really great educators. We don't have a lot of medical doctors on our staff. And so we're going to try to do a couple of things and maybe not do them as maximally impactfully as we could. And so by providing this technology and letting the community build on top of it, we're also maximizing the impact that it can have in terms of the benefits it can have for the world.
What I got from that is something that's coming to me is democratization. So only is it democratization of the idea of it being open source, but democratization in the sense of to create products that could help individuals even the playing field in different areas of sectors that they're working in, whether it's small business, whether it's educational tools.
Yeah, I mean, I got into this because I think I'm excited about technology, and I think technology is really valuable. But the reason that I work in the place where I work and do the work that I do is because of what you're saying, right? I think that the technology that we're building has the potential to give access to, companies and countries that wouldn't necessarily have the resources to build an open source model. I mean, there are a very small number of organizations that can do that. And by making that available to all of these organizations, it's helping them to compete in the AI space as well. But also think about, if you're a small business that's starting, a retail business on Instagram in your apartment, the kinds of things that big companies have, multi-million-dollar ad agencies or hundreds of people to do customer support, you're just not going to have that. And so I actually think one of the more powerful but less talked about aspects of this technology is giving the ability for those small businesses to scale and compete with the large businesses in the way that they wouldn't otherwise.
I think it's so important because there's a lot of founders here, I'm assuming in this room, and those who understand the founder language, and most of the money that you have when you get your Series A or your startup cost is marketing, right? And be able to put that. So seemingly it seems like AI could be an offset in terms of how you can use that for marketing to offset some of your costs that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's right. And I mean, what you've started to see us do initially, and is an area where we're going to continue to focus, is what are ways that this technology not only can be innovative and groundbreaking from a technical perspective, but I think even more importantly, the ways that we can then take that technology and use it to solve problems for real people. And so this idea of helping businesses with marketing and getting the scale that they wouldn't otherwise have, it's something that the company's been really invested in for, the past decade, more than a decade that I've been there, but that I think as we think about artificial intelligence as a tool, that's going to enable those things more effectively.
Something I want to go to in terms of a use case, because I know I don't have a lot of time to talk with you. Something that is on a lot of individuals' minds right now is when it comes to intellectual property, and people being afraid of the intellectual property being used for these language models to learn off of. In particular, there was a lawsuit that was done recently with the music industry where record labels were suing these music AI companies, saying that these AI companies are leveraging their catalog to learn off of. I don't want you commenting on that case at all or giving any input into the guilt or liability or not on these companies, but how are you guys thinking about the data set that may contain intellectual property, in particular those in the creator space? Because so many creators use your platform, particularly on Instagram, to promote their music, to find new fan bases, and the like.
Yeah, so I'll give you two answers. I mean, the first is sort of obvious, but important to say, which is this is a really hard societal question. You have these technologies that require a bunch of data to be trained, to train them. If you couldn't use data, then the technology wouldn't exist. And so if we want the technology to exist, then we need to be able to have training data. At the same time, we want creators to, and especially for a company like ours that relies on having a community of creators, we want creators to have the freedom to control their content and make sure that it's used in ways that they want. And I think, for cases like you're talking about, I mean, the reality is this is a question for Congress and legislatures around the world that they need to think about. And I would predict it's going to take a while for them to think about it. It's going to take a while for these cases to work their way through the court system. So I actually don't think we'll have a definitive answer for maybe a decade, in some ways. At the same time, in terms of how we are thinking about it, I mean, I do think, both of the things that I said are true, which is it's important for us to be able to not only build these technology for the benefit of everyone, but also to do it in a way that is broadly representative and serves the different communities that we have an obligation to serve, which is why we're thinking not just about, taking as much data from one country, but thinking about what are other languages that we need to serve, what are other communities that we need to serve. So that's part of it. But then I think there's also this aspect of, making sure that creators and people who control who have information, who have content that they've created, to choose how they want it to use it. And so we're in the early stages of this, but if you look at, for example, on the internet, there's a standard some people have talked about. It's called robots.txt, which is basically a mechanism where if you're a website, you can say, okay, I want my data to be crawled by these companies. I don't want my website to be crawled by these companies. And so I think we're starting to use things like that as a society as a way for people to say, like, yeah, I want to be included in this because I think it's really important. And another creator might say, I actually don't want anything to do with it. And I think that's okay. We just need to be thinking about both how do we optimize for the technology to continue to be able to exist and be available for everyone, because this technology is really important for creators, but also how do we make sure people are in control?
With the last question that I have, it's kind of more of a closing statement for you to have this opportunity to make your case, because even individuals in this room, although we've had a very robust conversation, can still be very skeptical and to trust that Meta is going to do the right thing. In rooms I'm in constantly, I hear all the time how people are afraid of AI and these different types of products, and they want to make sure that they can feel safe and protected. What do you in your team think about in your meetings when you hear that narrative that's overwhelmingly from society, that's coming from a place of either let's take a pause, I'm afraid of it, it's too big for society because we haven't thought through enough of the details?
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's something that I think everybody that works on AI at our company takes extremely seriously. We have a responsibility to think seriously about the risks and those issues. I think, in some ways, if we were just to say, like, we're going to take a pause, we're not going to do this, the technology is going to exist in the world whether we build it or not. And so I think in some ways, just getting so caught up in, we're worried about it is a little bit of an abdication of responsibility on our part. And I feel a lot of humility and responsibility to our community to think like, going back to what we were talking about before, how should we be thinking about the specific problems that the world needs us to solve? What are the things that we need to do? You talked about like privacy in the training data. We talked about copyright. We talked about safety and bias issues. All of these things, like what are the actual challenges that we're worried about? And what can we do as we're building the technology to make sure that we're not leaving these benefits that we talked about on the table, but that we're building responsibly. So spending a lot of time thinking about not just the sort of top line of whether there's risk or not, but like what is actually what are the challenges and what do we need to do to address them?
Rob Sherman, thank you so much for bringing this incredible thoughts and how you guys are thinking about these big, complex issues to the Aspen Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, give him a round of applause.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. But we are not done yet because we still have more conversation to go regarding the ecosystem of Meta. And so what we just heard from was Rob, but now we're going to hear from Meta's Oversight Board to really talk about essentially the separation of church and state and what is their role in actually holding individuals at Meta like Rob accountable in order to protect humanity as a whole. So I have an amazing group of panelists who have joined me for this quick switch. To my left, I have Paolo Carrozza. We did this word association where it's car and pizza at the same time, and I knew that was going to mess me up, so I wanted to talk about pizza because I'm slightly hungry. How you feeling, Paolo?
Great, Mike. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Oh, it's so good to have you, my friend. Next to Paolo, we have the incredible Suzanne Nazo. What's happening, friend?
Doing well. Glad to be here.
Okay, good. And then to my left, we have Mr. Kenji Yoshino. How you feeling, Kenji?
It's great to be here. I feel great.
Oh, I'm so happy that you guys are here to join me. So, Kenji, let's just start. There seemingly is to be a separation of church and state between the Oversight Board and Meta. Is there a reason why you and Rob could not share the same panel together in the same stage?
Well, I'm not sure if it goes quite that far. We do try to, underscore our independence. So we are a completely independent body that oversees Meta's content moderation decisions against international human rights standards.
Mm-hmm. So in short, Suzanne, what is the Oversight Board?
Sure. Look, there's 22 of us. People have amazing backgrounds like these two guys on my left and my right. They're both really distinguished law professors. The board is global. So we have representation from Pakistan, from India, from Israel, from Egypt, Sub-Saharan Africa. And it is a mini kind of United Nations. There's a former prime minister. There is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. So it's a pretty extraordinary group. And we get together to adjudicate and evaluate some of the toughest edge cases on content on the Meta platform, like whether Donald Trump should be taken off Meta's platforms after his acts of what people thought was incitement and stoking violence in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Or we just looked at a case with President Biden where it was a manipulated video. He was putting a "I voted" sticker on his granddaughter's chest after she cast her ballot, and the poster had slowed it down, so it looked like it was something more nefarious and inappropriate. And the question was, should that stay up? Should it go down? And why? And we, as part of our work, enumerate and elaborate the human rights standards that are at play. We say, is this an issue of free expression? Do they have the right to say that? Is this harmful? Is it political manipulation? How do you evaluate those interests one against the other? And we issue a detailed, reasoned opinion, and we debate a lot amongst ourselves to kind of come up with what we think is the right answer. And that is our work. We also do some larger issues of policy that get thrown our way. For example, looking at, there's a word shaheed that means martyr in Arabic, but it can also mean some other things. It's the most enforced against word on all of Meta platforms. And so they threw to us the question of, are we taking down this word too much? How should we treat it in general across our platform. So that's a quick overview.
Now, Paolo, I hear Suzanne, I hear what she's saying, and it all sounds great. I love to hear about the deliberation, right? But the really question that I have is this binding, right? And when you guys lay down your opinions and your decisions, does Meta actually have to put this into use and into action?
Yeah, so there are two levels. I mean, we're making decisions on specific pieces of content. Meta has contractually bound itself to implement those decisions, and they do, always, 100% of the time. When we decide a specific piece of content should stay up or should come down, that decision is binding on Meta. But beyond that, what we really do, which has much broader significance and importance for the standards of freedom of expression and the protection of other human rights on all of the platforms, we make decisions about Facebook and Instagram and Threads, is these broader recommendations that are not binding on Meta as such, but Meta does commit publicly to respond to any of our recommendations within 60 days. So they have to explain, are they going to accept it and implement it? Are they not? But if not, why not? Do they need some more time to study the situation? And that's really where a lot of the action is, right? Because there we're trying to make broad systemic changes that improve the user experience across the board.
Can I jump in with some for instances there? Because I think what Paolo said is really important. Also, Suzanne, I think it's like 50-50 as to whether or not your hand just now in this Aspen video will become a meme, right? The Biden video and manipulated media. Yeah, exactly. So they'll slow it down and what have you. But just to give a couple of examples of recommendations that we think that have improved the platform, one issue is users just often don't know why their content has been removed and have no capacity to explain that. So within a 1-month period, there were 7 million appeals from decisions that we made or that Meta made to take down content as violative of hate speech norms. And based on one of our recommendations, users now have the option to explain and give more context by checking, like, I did this to raise awareness, or I did this as a form of satire or humor. And so Meta can now internalize that information when it takes the appeal. Similarly, in a 3-month period last year, there were 100 million pieces of content that were flagged by Meta sort of preemptively, according to one of our recommendations, to say, this is potentially violative content. So rather than this black box that says, this has been violating, we're going to take this down, you now get a kind of warning or a flag that says, this could be potentially violating, would you like to edit it, so that you at least have a chance to make it through the various content moderation policies. So that's actually, I mean, the take-up, leave-down decisions are really important, and those are binding. But I think oftentimes people say, Mike, that just because this is persuasion or hortatory, that it's therefore irrelevant because Meta can ignore us. But a lot of the things that Meta does to improve the platform, because they want to improve their platform too, are things that arise out of our recommendations.
With that use case, I want to unpack that just a little bit, because I'm curious to then understand from what point of view are you coming from. Because, Suzanne, you talked about just how globally diverse the Oversight Board is. And Paolo, you've lended itself to really talk about how many situations are happening across the globe. Rob and I was just talking about the complexities and just in him having to deal with countries and governments in Korea and in Ghana. So as you guys are looking at these use cases, determining whether or not this is freedom of expression, from whose POV? Is it from the United States POV? Is it from the Ghana's government POV? Is it from Kenya's POV?
Can I set the stage just for a second for your answer?
If you must, absolutely.
Only to say, I mean, just to give you a sense of the range of different kinds of cases and situations. I mean, a lot of these are the most consequential freedom of expression issues in online information ecosystem that are present today. So we're dealing with cases involving armed conflicts in Israel and Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, social protests in Iran and Colombia and Cuba, cases from Brazil regarding elections, Pakistan, and India regarding religiously motivated violence. So it really is important, the question that Suzanne's going to sort of flesh out for us.
Yeah,
but Kenji, no, I want to, got it, but I want to stick to the question. So the question I asked Kenji, which POV is it coming from as you're deliberating, Kenji? You don't mind?
Oh, you want me to? Yeah. Well,
just because you were talking about the case.
I'll take a cut at it. So one of the things is, the community standards that Meta articulates are global. we advert to international human rights standards because those are also global. So one of the things that I had to learn when I was sort of climbing up the learning curve as a newest member of the board was to unlearn everything I knew about First Amendment law and to say we're in the domain of super compliance, we're in a global domain, and there is no kind of geofencing with regard to the community standards. And so we're really thinking about this against a background of international human rights law. And then at the same time, even though our aspirations are to lay down these standards that are universal, we understand that context matters a huge amount for all the reasons that Paolo was describing. So there is no panel. We sit in panels of 5. Every time we sit as a panel, there is no panel without regional representation. And that regional representation means, to Suzanne's point about diversity, that there's a voice from that region that allows us to make, to change what must be changed in order to adapt these universal principles to particular contexts.
Suzanne, does those regional specific panels inform other regional panels as you guys are thinking about your decisions?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're diverse along many dimensions. We're politically diverse. I mean, one of the things for me that's been most unique in this experience being part of the Oversight Board is that we're overrepresented as Americans on the board because Meta is based in the United States, for better or for worse, that is true. But among the Americans, we're really on a political spectrum. We have 3 people who I'd say are identifiably conservative, probably 3 who are identifiably more liberal, and we really have a give and take on tough issues, how we think about questions like nudity or how we think about the parameters of political speech. And I would say, in my life and in our world, that's rather unique, being able to get into those details, even with colleagues from other parts of the political spectrum here domestically. And then globally, we have a case on River to the Sea and whether that is hate speech. And we have people, who are going to have some role in that decision who sit on the board, who come from Israel, who come from the Arab world. And so it's quite extraordinary to sit down. Never do I sit down sort of coming in with an opinion that doesn't get changed as part of the deliberation.
So Paolo, Suzanne just led me to think about something really interesting, as because over time, definitions of words change. And depend upon which culture you represent, depend upon which country you're in, and depend upon which region of the country you're in, there is a different interpretation or the evolution of the words or phrases. How do you guys think about that when it comes to the Oversight Board, when you're looking at these very controversial and consequential decisions?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the most persistent and one of the most difficult questions we face across almost every case is a question of how to integrate the realities of local context, being variable. And this is where a lot of the discussion here is focused around artificial intelligence. We all recognize the value of AI even as a tool of more sophisticated content moderation. It's getting better all the time, and that's really important. But at the end of the day, it's never going to be perfect exactly at that space where you really need to understand the human context of words, like you say. And so it's critical that at the end of the day, there is this oversight board that Meta has invested in human capital, right? Not just in algorithms, but a group of diverse people who are going to hash it out around the table, who understand different contexts and different languages and can talk to each other. And it's hard, right? I won't lie. We fight a lot. We also we have a great deal of respect for each other, and we reach amazing consensual decisions most of the time. But also, you read our opinions, which are all public on the website, and you'll see minority opinions in there regularly on a lot of things, exactly on these kinds of issues, right? On the meaning of words, on the context in which they're expressed and stuff. There aren't always very clear answers.
So that goes to critical thinking, and I want to come to you, Kenji, because when I think about these decisions and topics, I'm thinking about critical thinking in the sense of where we are with digital literacy, right? And the fact of in a lot of school systems and the fundamental trainings from K through 12 or whatever it is, the equivalency in different countries, we don't have a digital curriculum. And so as you guys are thinking about this in the Oversight Board from a philosophical standpoint of view, whose role is it to do the critical thinking? Is it society needs to be more advanced on the critical thinking and to build up the digital literacy? Or is it the role of Meta and other tech, let me not use other tech companies, is it the role of Meta to actually do the critical thinking for the users?
I think it's all of the above. I think it's a trap to think that one body is going to be responsible for this when it has to be a conversation among all stakeholders. So I just want to riff off of what Paolo said, because I think it's so important, which is to say we create these reasoned, opinions, and we don't necessarily always know that we're right. Oftentimes there's a dissenting, opinion or a more minority view that's expressed, and we don't take it as our job to say, this is a final pronouncement and we are absolutely kind of bulletproof on this. Rather, what we want to say is we want to give you reasons. Like the dearth of what is really lacking in these contexts is that reasoned, back and forth. And so if we can model that and to say, there's always going to be dispute in society as to who's right about this, but if we can model a respectful, thoughtful, reasoned debate about this, then maybe we can convince other people to engage in that as well.
Suzanne, that goes to what you're talking about in terms of the slang word of that, in terms of reasoning, word evolution, and what that is.
Yeah, that's right. And we commission linguistic experts sometimes to tell us, what is the panoply of ways in which this word may be interpreted. And it can differ, depending on the geography and the subculture. And so if we're talking to a global platform, kind of how do we deal with those nuances? We have to give a single answer. I think that's one of the good disciplines of the board, is that they really hold us to, we had a policy advisory opinion on COVID-related disinformation and whether kind of several years into the pandemic, should Meta ease up? They had been very restrictive with COVID-related disinformation, and should free expression sort of be given more birth as the pandemic died down? And it was sort of, well, in some jurisdictions, it's really ebbed. Elsewhere, it's still a real problem, but we have to come up with a global kind of rule on that. And so that discipline to try to synthesize what we're taking in, this regional contextual knowledge, to what degree that should be a factor, or to what degree operating, and I'll just mention the word scale, because every single case we deal with, we have this dilemma of meta platforms being so enormous, and kind of all of the nuancing and thought that we come up with as a board has to then meet this massive platform, and the question of how on earth can that be implemented across these billions of posts and users.
So Supreme Court has just entered the chat just now, because Suzanne, you have led me to exactly something that I wanted to ask you guys today, because I had nothing else to do but read Supreme Court decisions, because they've been very active this week, and so I've been doing a lot of unpacking. And part of that is that case that came from the Supreme Court about COVID and misinformation, and also too around the general election. Justice Susan Comey Barrett said something really interesting in her opinion. Barrett explained that the private companies, including Facebook, had their own First Amendment rights and were lawfully moderating content on the platforms, removing and reducing posts well before contact from the Biden administration. And Paulo, to you, with that opinion and the Supreme Court ruling, how does that does it have any impact on how you guys are thinking about content moderation? Does it give you guys more cover to go a little bit deeper and more specific in terms of how you guys are making your decisions?
I mean, yes and no. As Kenji pointed out, we're deliberately not applying the standards of any one country. And that includes the United States, as important as First Amendment law is. Now, 6 of the 22 members are from the United States. We've been formed in the ethos of the protection of freedom of expression in the United States. We come with very strong presumptions about the centrality of that human right. But we're trying to understand also the perspectives of people who come from very, very different contexts, in which the government suppression of speech takes a very different form. And can be very closely related, for example, not just to a question about vaccine misinformation, but literally about life and death, and violence and political incitement against opponents. So we have to try to bring all of those things together. So the Supreme Court gives us really important material to consider, but to consider always, again, in a global context. And in that sense, I'll mention one other thing that I think is important to flesh out some of the questions you've been asking, Mike, which is to realize that we don't just rely on our own judgment. We make a point of getting as much input as we can. Suzanne mentioned external experts on technical questions like linguistic stuff. We also open up every single case to public comment. Anybody can issue comments on specific questions related to cases. And we read all those comments, we take them into account. We get comments from all over the world, from civil society, activist organizations, from academics, from ordinary citizens. And that's important stakeholder input to try to understand all this context.
But I do want to stick on that Supreme Court case issue. And Kenji, I'm going to come to you to expand upon that, recognizing that you guys are global, recognizing you guys do deal with other contested posts from other countries. You guys did mention mentioned, Suzanne, that you guys do have panels that you convene regionally. So for the United States issues and cases that come up in your regional panel that gets convened, how does that decision from the Supreme Court impact when you guys are empaneling the United States region when it comes to content moderation? Because content moderation is a big topic right now in America in terms of how we are proceeding with AI in particular and with conversation going forward.
Yeah, I think the way in which it's most relevant is just to, carry forward the kind of core insight there, which is that private actors are simply different from governmental actors, right? So what is Meta being analogized to? So for a lot of individuals, they say like, well, Meta's like the government to me. They have a lot of power over me, and so therefore, they should be held to the same standard as a statist actor. Whereas another way of viewing it, as Justice Barrett was noting, is that Meta is a private company. It has its own speech rights that can be asserted against the government, right? So, our decisions are hopefully quite nuanced in thinking about that private-public decision. So let me give you an example of a blackface case.
Yeah.
So there was a case where there was a Dutch tradition, as I, understand it, of creating sooty peat, right? And this is not, an allusion to any kind of tradition of slavery. And so what we said is this should be taken down because of the impact that it would have on a global body of viewers. But we also underscored that this would not be something that would be permissible under international human rights law if this were a government saying, we need to take this down. Right? And so we drew a distinction between the private and the public actor, and I think that kind of question of like, is Meta more analogous to the government, or is it more analogous to the individual speaker? That's the kind of question that the Supreme Court is wrestling with, and we wrestle with it as well.
Did that go to history? I heard someone ask a question, I don't know if he's in here right now, but it goes to the controversial aspects of history, and we're almost now in this revisionist history period, depending upon who you talk to and where you are. Suzanne, I was kind of going to throw that to you when it comes to this case that Kenji is talking about.
Yeah.
Do you look at it from historical context, archival context, educational context?
Right. I mean, look, I'd say we don't see ourselves as arbiters of truth or historical fact. We generally try to stay away from that. We're looking at it through a lens of international human rights law. Is this something that, and under international human rights law, the idea of incitement is much broader than it is under US law. Under US law, as you may know, we recognize legally only incitement to imminent violence, and that's a very narrow category. Internationally, they recognize concepts like incitement to discrimination and bias. And so if we evaluate a piece of content and recognize that that could be a legitimate basis upon which to say blackface should not be permitted on the Meta platforms, that gives us some grounding to make a decision like that. But there is enormous scope on social media for falsehoods, for historical revisionism that may not be factually grounded. And for us as a body that cares about freedom of expression, we have this very delicate kind of line drawing of, when does the harm kind of cross over into something that we think should not be permitted, and where action to mitigate that harm ought to override the free speech interest, and then can we ground it solidly in international human rights law? That is our touchstone. We have to find a way of arguing that the takedown is justifiable. And then there are big questions we're getting into about, how does international human rights law apply differently to a private platform as opposed to a government? It was created and conceived to adjudicate what governments could do. It was not built with private companies in mind. And so there's a lot of inductive thinking that we have to do that's still very much a work in progress about how and why it should apply to a private platform.
If I could be a fly on the wall in these conversations and panels, I love this type of conversation and really think about big, complex issues and to figure out how to solve for it and what is best. Paulo, you guys often, I hear, sometimes you guys refer to as the Supreme Court. And so I'm just wondering about, I love the word precedent, and my audience knows I overuse the word precedent. And so I'm just curious, do you guys ever have precedent of one case that you guys use when you're thinking about other cases?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a major principle of how we're trying to make the reasoned decisions that Kenji was talking about earlier. We're very aware that so let me back up one step, right? We're deciding an exceedingly small number of cases, right? I should be really clear about that. And that's intentional. We're not trying to resolve every dispute across millions and literally hundreds of millions of posts a day. We're very selective, just a few cases that we think are emblematic of larger problems, okay? But precisely because we're so selective of just a few emblematic cases, it's really critical that the decision we make, we're trying to think and keep in mind all of the subsequent cases that are going to be like this. Right? The thinking about what precedential value it's going to establish for similarly situated cases in the future is absolutely central to the way that we try to make this a reasoned, justified decision.
Yeah. I'm smiling, Paulo, not because you said anything comedic or funny. I'm laughing because I was so excited to go head first with you guys and get into the heady stuff that I failed to ask a really basic question. Kenji, how do I protest to you guys?
Oh,
like if
yeah.
I see a post like on Facebook or Instagram, like, is there an Instagram handle you guys have? Like, do I DM you? Like, how does that?
Just go to the Oversight Board page, and then you can file an appeal through that. You know.
Okay, I can't believe that was such a basic. I was like, I don't even know how I would even do that.
But can I fill in like two other
Of
basics?
course.
Yeah. So one is riffing off of what Paulo said of our respect for precedent is one of the things that drives us to issue decisions with all 22 members voting on every single decision, because that keeps us true and honest with regard to reconciling our every single decision against all the other decisions that have come before it. And so that's the way we think about it. I also have to say that I personally bristle a little bit when Paulo says we decide a very small number of cases. Yes, like last year we decided sort of north of 50 cases. We're tracking for that this year. But I just want to note that 50 plus cases may not sound like a lot, but this year the United States Supreme Court issued decisions in 60 cases.
And they're
full-time. We are part-time, right? So I ask for a little bit of grace on that issue because I don't want to feel like we're constantly apologizing about our output.
Yeah,
which
it's
I
only
actually
relative
think is
to a scale of 3 billion. It's a little bit small. Right?
One
more thing that I think might nicely tie together these issues of semiotics that you were raising earlier, the issues of scale and interpretation that Suzanne was noting. Like one of the things that I find most gratifying about being on the board is that scale and that impact that we can have for good. And one of the cases that we decided in the past year was a case about the trans flag. And so this came out of Poland. It was a picture of a trans flag hung like a curtain, and the caption was "Self-hanging curtains, spring cleaning." Right? And so this actually suggests, like to Paulo and Suzanne's point, about how really, like, no matter how sophisticated AI is, it's always going to be like a war of escalation, where there's going to be what we call malign creativity, borrowing from GLAD, like on the other side as well, where they're going to escalate how clever they are about flying under the radar. So ultimately, it's going to be up to some human beings, of which I'm lucky enough currently to be one, to look at this and to say, we're not making up the standard, right? So my own priors about gender identity or trans stuff, even as a lifelong LGBTQIA+ advocate, have nothing to do with this, because Meta itself is a standard that says you cannot, create hate speech on the basis of trans identity. But it's us looking at this flag and saying, like, we need context in order to understand this, but this is clearly a call for trans individuals to commit suicide, at least, in the view of many on the board who carried the day and ultimately led to a takedown of this content. Yeah. And I will say, we issued this as a board, so I'm not claiming any kind of personal touch on this decision, but I did go home to my husband that day and I said, I spent like 25 years as an LGBTQIA+ advocate. I think I did more good with this decision that the board issued today than I've done in the preceding 25 years, right? Because we're talking about 4 billion people, right, who are monthly users, right, of Meta's platforms. And if you can make it just that much safer for the trans population on that platform, that's a win. So scale isn't necessarily like something that we always have to struggle with. Scale can be a wonderful thing about maximizing our impact.
I just want to let that breathe just for a second, because I think that you guys, Kenji, was you just saying that, put something really powerful into context, in particular in relationship to the jokingly riff of only 50 cases. but you guys are doing 50 cases, but the one of the 50 represented safety for 4 billion users. And so I think when you put that into context, just of the global scale of Meta, but also too, just of the global impact of the decisions that the Oversight Board is making, it may seem small in number, but it's very vast and large in scale. And thank you for sharing that vulnerable moment of your 25 years of activism, but just in one single instance, way more than that. So I just wanted to have that moment just for a second. With the 1 minute and 17 seconds I have remaining, Suzanne, I want to go to you because I'm sure you guys get prompted on your website with tons of cases. Just for transparency's sake, like how are you guys thinking about how are you going to pick a batch of 50?
Yeah, look, I'd say uppermost in our minds is, what are users around the world most worried about, most upset about? Is it the impact of social media on our politics, on distrusted institutions, on mental health, be it of LGBTQ populations, of youth, of girls that are targeted by revenge porn and manipulated imagery of their bodies online? And so all of those things loom very large, knowing what people care about, what they are upset about. And we try to look at that through a global lens. We try not just to have the perspective of, what's in the New York Times in the morning, but what are people thinking about in Islamabad, in Karachi, in Nairobi, what's on their minds, how do we be responsive to them? Because we've been imbued with this big power, and with that comes a big responsibility to be the voice of those users speaking truth to Meta.
Paulo, Suzanne, Kenji, thank you so much for what you do on behalf of 4 billion people. Until next time, folks.
Thanks, Mike.
Give them a round of applause.